Well, it's safe to say we've probably driven more cars than the average person. Do you guys have like favorite and least favorite GM cars that you've driven to date?
Well, I guess unlike Byron, I believe most of almost the entirety of my GM driving experience has been like in a professional capacity, like driven cars. So since like 2006, and so within that time frame, I'm going to keep it to there. And I was tempted by the Pontiac G8. That was a really cool car. It had a lot of. It was from Australia, so it had a lot of like wacky pants interior stuff, which made it kind of interesting and charming, yet also bad. It looked fantastic. It was fantastic to drive too. C8, C7 Vet again. You mentioned that the CTS, or actually no, the last CTSV. That thing was
Hmm.
great. But I'm going to say the original Chevy Volt is the best that I've driven because of just how significant it was. Not unlike the Bolts, but how much of a technical achievement it was. It was a plug-in hybrid. They called it any number of marketing things, but that's what it was. It was a plug-in hybrid, way ahead of everything else, and it was such a solid concept. It was revolutionary, just for GM, but for the entire industry. And yeah, it only had two back seats, and the ones that were there were cramped, and the aero dam on the front like scraped on everything, like everything. It's molehill, everything. It scraped on everything. But and yeah, it wasn't as cool as the concept car, but it was a terrific city car. Like I drove it. We back in the old days, we had one as a long termer, and I drove it constantly in LA traffic, and it was fantastic. It had one pedal driving. It was pretty quick with that electric motor. It was had that low center of gravity. That the battery ran down the center of the car in like a T fashion, so you had it literally low and in the center of the car, really grounded. It was surprisingly fun to drive. Really kind of cool interior controls, touch capacitive, which were, but at the time pretty neat. Had the white kind of iMac center
Oh
console,
man, yeah.
um, and I drove it a lot. I love that car, and because it was a plug-in hybrid, you could actually take it on a road trip. It was pretty comfortable and decent, trunk space. It's a really like cool car. I think it I hope it gets remembered for being, maybe it didn't end up being a big seller, maybe it wasn't as important in the long run, but at the time it was a big deal, and I think it was a pretty big achievement, and GM at its best.
Did you ever drive the Cadillac version? I can't remember what the Cadillac version of the Volt was called.
ELR, I did,
Yes.
Mm.
I
What'd you
did.
think of that one?
Oh, well, interesting because that thing was actually really good too. Like it was just like mechanically the same thing. It had this lovely interior and looked pretty cool, but the price was hilarious. Like
Yeah.
it was announced and we all laughed. Like I'm
Yeah.
not. This is like we laughed because it was so outrageously, insanely expensive that we thought they were kidding. Like
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that was the one that actually Cadillac offered like a I don't know if they called it a performance package, but like a sport package for that one that actually had like a sport tune suspension and stuff too, if I remember right. I think it was maybe later in life, like near when they canceled it, but I think that happened. Oh, and they actually retuned the powertrain too. So it wasn't just that it handled better, but it actually got more punch, which did reduce its total range.
All right, Byron, what do you got for your favorite?
So this is another just throwing another wrench this time. Um, of the ones I've actually driven, I'm actually going to go with the CT5V Blackwing, and and again, this is getting weird because I have driven the C8 and obviously I've driven the CT5V too, and the CT5V Blackwing that the supercharged V8 in that thing, there's such a sense of occasion with that car, and honestly, the only reason well, okay, there are two reasons why I chose the CT4V over CT5V. First of all, it's cheaper. Openly acknowledging that it is about you're talking about $20,000 to $25,000 difference once you actually load them up and start playing around with stuff. Also, like I come from basically having two big V8 American cars almost in a row over the past few years, and so I was just ready for small again. But the CT5V Blackwing is not really that big. It's not really that heavy. It's only like 200 pounds more than the CT4V. and it sounds amazing. Everything about it is just so much, but it's just like it's 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 impressive. It's a show, but like, where would I ever use it? I mean, it's not like the 4 is so underpowered that I can it's not like a Miata, but at the same time, like what makes the 5 so much better than the 4 doesn't make it any better for what I'm gonna do with it. Like, I'm gonna track it, I'm gonna autocross it, but the V8 doesn't necessarily make it any better at either of those things. It just makes it more fun the rest of the time when it's making noise. And I've done the V8 noise thing, so, I'm moving on. But I just still I appreciate it for what it is. It is one of the most impressive products GM's ever put together. And certainly top 3 for the ones I've driven of theirs all time, with the C8 and the 4 being the others that I would throw in there.
How about worst?
uh, so okay, a couple years back, well, when the pandemic started, I decided I was going to go stay with my parents in New Mexico for a couple months, and I did a one-way rental. So I rented a then new-ish, it was a 2020, I believe, Chevy Malibu from Enterprise. And while it was an incredibly competent car, it was still an Enterprise rental car in the middle of the pandemic, which meant it had, I don't even remember how many miles were on it. I don't think I've driven a rental car that's ever had more than about 7,500 miles on it before in my life. This one had well in excess of 10,000. It had, by rental standards, one of the longest lives of a car you would find for rent in the domestic fleets from a real rental company. Not like just, Jack's down the road, but a national chain that, it smelled, it made me sick driving it. Like, I actually had, my sinuses were getting inflamed by whatever was traveling through the vents and the HVAC in that car. It was terrible, but it got me there. Mechanically, everything about it was great, but it just reminded me how poorly those cars wear when they're not taken care of. Because that's what, any car is going to suffer from neglect, right? But not all cars are equally hard wearing. And I'll tell you, 2020 Chevy Malibu is not a hard wearing
Jeez.
vehicle.
So your worst was not just a general year make model; it was literally a car.
that
There's a
particular
VIN
car.
number
Yep.
associated
Yeah.
with your choice.
The license plate was. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
that one actually it did legitimately have some problems with it though. The electrical system just quit on me at one point when I was cruising through a small town in New Mexico, 30-mile-an-hour speed limit. It wasn't a big deal. But literally just everything in the car just turned off. The engine was still running, but the transmission stopped responding to anything. So I just had to ease it off the side of the road, shut it off, turn it back on, and yeah, like any good router, it was back and ready to roll. But that was an interesting experience.
I have a deep well of turd sandwiches over the years, entirely from the 2000s. That was not a good era. But ultimately, I am going with the Hummer H2 SUT, the truck.
Oh yeah.
Now, yes, it was appallingly fuel inefficient. How inefficient, we don't know. It was a heavy duty truck, so they didn't actually have to report fuel economy. Yes, it was offensively enormous and clogged parking lots and the views of mountains, etc. But here's the other thing: it was not good. It was just objectively not a very good or useful vehicle. It was the size of a house on the outside, but inside it wasn't big at all.
Yeah.
I sat in the back seat of one, and I was like this in the back seat. It had no space to speak of. The truck. I'm talking about the SUT because the regular one was also all of what I'm saying, but the SUT in particular, the bed on that was wider than it was long. Think about that for a second. It wasn't even 3 feet long, and yeah, it had the avalanche mid-gate thing, but I mean, really. So it was, as a truck, kind of useless. It was also slow. Like, we're talking about 0 to 60 in the 10s. Visibility, terrible visibility. Interior quality, because it was a 2000s GM product, was not good for the money or period. So yeah, it could have gotten 50 miles per gallon, and it still would have been just bad.